At the beginning of last week, I started a gospel meeting, and I could tell Wednesday night my voice was beginning to go. And I thought, well, it'll be fine by Sunday. And that is not the case. So we'll begin with an apology for that. Usually when I preach, I have a higher pitch and a louder voice. But tonight, I'm going to try to keep it a little subdued so that I'll have enough to get through the entire lesson. But sure do appreciate you inviting me to come over and to present this lesson. I want to start out by telling you a little something about preaching. One of the more interesting parts of that occurs in the church foyer. And there are occasions, most occasions, where people are very encouraging about a sermon and will come out and tell you whether you did good or not. They'll tell you what a good job the sermon was and give you some of that encouragement. Every once in a while, you have somebody come out and say, I totally disagree with you. And that's okay, right? You just ask, well, think about it, and then let's get together and talk about it. But there was one occasion where I felt I was about to be punched in the face. A young man came out, and his face was red. The veins in his neck were bulging, angry tears coming out of his eyes. The sermon had been on how to deal with depression. And I thought how interesting that was in a whole lot of different ways. Of all the things I preached about, the one where I might get into a physical altercation is on the idea of depression. And so I took him by the arm and I said, let's go to my office. Let's talk about this, see what's going on. He said, do you think I want to be this way? You think I want to take all this medication? And so as we talked, I said, you do understand there's 250 more people in this congregation. And there are people who are struggling with this, not just you. And I remember the awareness that came on his face as if he had never thought about that before. And I learned something about depression, that it brings us to so narrowly focus on ourselves that oftentimes we think that, and I'm going to discuss this a little bit later, that nobody knows what's going on but me. And I realized at that point, though I had already realized it to a great extent, what an epidemic we have of this in the United States. I didn't look up the current statistics I have before, but it's staggering how many people are on some kind of antidepressant. And that may be you, and I'm not condemning you at all in that. But I've come to see that there are a lot of people who are struggling with this, and this is totally anecdotal on my part. But the ones that I have had the most dealings with are young men, basically in their 20s and 30s. And it's just kind of like they're lost. And rather than what we might have thought about in earlier generations, you move out of your parents' house, you get a job, you date, you get married, you move on with your life. It's almost like these young men are kind of stuck, the ones at least who've come to me to talk about it. And so much of what I'm going to talk about tonight comes from firsthand conversations. Much of this is going to deal with things that I have talked personally with those who've dealt with it. Now, I always like to start things like this with a disclaimer. I am not a doctor. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not a trained counselor. I'm not any of these things. I'm just a gospel preacher. And so, if you are dealing with depression, I don't want you for 1 minute to think that I'm standing up here judging you and saying you're dealing with it the wrong way. I think I have heard some of that in Christian circles before. But it may be that you need to be in the care of a professional. And if you are, that is just fine. In fact, that may be a really good thing. And it may be that you've been placed on an antidepressant, and that might be the very right thing to do. What I want you to consider, though, as a member of the household of God, is that God has told us how to deal with depression. And while that may call for other things, as we've just mentioned, we need to start where God starts. And I think for a lot of people, that if they earnestly look for the answer within the Word of God, they're going to find the help that's needed there. So, if you're dealing with depression right now, I hope that this lesson is going to be beneficial. If you are not, I can almost guarantee you that a family member or close friend is. That there is someone in your circle who's dealing with these things, and it may be that what we talk about tonight will at least get you thinking along the lines of things that you could suggest that might be helpful to someone who's really struggling in this area that can just tear one's life apart. So I mentioned I'm not a psychiatrist. For 30 plus years, I was a high school teacher. Up until last May, I had been doing that. And for many of those years, I taught government and economics to high school seniors. And so when we would get into economics, one of the things we would talk about is equilibrium. And so you're aware of this, that when you go into business, you're wanting your demand and supply to meet. In other words, you want to produce as much as is going to be bought. And so economists, both on the national scale who are dealing with governmental kind of things, right on down to mom and pop businesses, whether they call it this or not, are all seeking to find that equilibrium because that's where the profit is. That's where you're going to make money. Now, in the economy as a whole, if either of those kind of gets out of kilter, demand exceeds supply, you don't have enough for people, or you got too much supply, not enough demand, it's going to cause a problem. And a temporary part of that is a recession. But if that recession continues on, we know what it's called, don't we? It's called a depression. And so we have had several extremely difficult depressions in the history of our country. The last one being in the 1930s or so, where people are out of work, they don't have money, and it's kind of like the economy just gets in this stalled position and it can't get itself back up again because that equilibrium hasn't been met. And I think that's a good way for us to start a discussion on what we call depression from more of an emotional, psychological standpoint. So, when life is going well, we might say there's an equilibrium there. Okay? So when life is where you want it to be, let's just call that the life equilibrium. So how does God define that? Well, he tells us in Peter, who's actually quoting from the Old Testament, that occurs when we love life and see good days. And hopefully that describes most of our lives. That we love life, we're having a good life, we're seeing these good days. But we well understand that no matter who we are, there's going to come a time when something happens that's going to cause life not to be very easy. And so the question then is, what do we do when that happens? Now there's a whole host of reasons this can occur. Some of it is very much self-inflicted. You think about someone who gets addicted to alcohol, someone who gets addicted to drugs, someone who gets addicted to gambling, someone who gets addicted to pornography, whatever it might be. Materialism would be another big problem in our country. And the idea is, I've got to have the drink, I've got to have the drug, I've got to have the pornography, I've got to have the stuff. And if I don't have these, then my life just isn't what it needs to be. So that's one side of it. But for most people, it's things that occur that you really have no control over. Maybe the death of a loved one. So maybe a very close family member dies, maybe unexpectedly, or maybe it's a severe downturn in your own health, that you get a diagnosis and suddenly life is now, in terms of doctor's appointments and treatments and this kind of thing, I'm sure we have some that can relate to that. Or maybe it's a loss of a job. You go in one day, you think everything's fine. The boss says, we're laying off people. Don't come back tomorrow. So any of those things can get that equilibrium out of balance, at least temporarily. Now, what most people can do is figure out a way around it. So if I lose a family member, I grieve, I mourn, but I move forward. Right? Remember the good times with that person. I lose my job, dust off my resume, I start looking for another job. And while there might be that temporary place where the equilibrium is disrupted, I'm going to figure out how to deal with that. That's really what life is all about. We do that quite often. However, for some people, when that problem, whatever it may be, comes along, they cannot figure out how to overcome it. And so suddenly now, you've got day after week after month where this is just kind of like on continual spin in your mind. And it's very magnetic. You have a problem, and now other problems occur, and what depression does is it magnifies all of those. And so if we're not really careful, when that disequilibrium occurs, we can't figure out how to overcome it, so we just kind of give up trying. And so we find ourselves then in this downward spiral that we would identify as depression. It's nothing new, though. That's what I hope we understand. And as I mentioned, God has given ways to deal with it, and one of those is He shows us depressed people. I'm not going to go through the whole list by any means. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples here. One that's very interesting is Samuel's mother, Hannah. You remember her story? She had major disequilibrium in her life. Her husband had married another wife. The other wife could have children. Hannah could not. The other wife, Peninnah, is mocking her, making fun of her, just making life miserable for her. And so she goes to the tabernacle to pray about it. And we find then that Eli thinks she's drunk. And he says, go somewhere else to drink your liquor, not here at the tabernacle. I guess there's a side lesson there on judging, isn't there? Because she was a fine woman. But listen to what she says. She says, no, my Lord, I am a woman troubled in spirit. And that's where depression comes from. Where we are troubled about what's gone on. And she goes on to say, what I've been doing is pouring out my soul before the Lord. So here's our first lesson. Here's a woman who is in the throes of a very bad circumstance, and she says to Eli, the way I'm dealing with this is I'm coming and I'm just putting it on the Lord. Now, the psalmists are a very depressed group. When you read through the Psalms, you've got some that are very energetic, some that are really talking about all the good things going on in life, but many of those Psalms, maybe even as many as a third of them, are dealing with times where someone's lamenting over a problem. We don't have time to go through all those tonight, but I want to give you one that really, I think, brings it into focus. In Psalm 88, verse 18, the psalmist says, you have taken from me friend and neighbor. Darkness is my closest friend. Now, if you had a family member or a friend say that to you, would you be concerned about that? If somebody said, I'm just so troubled that the darkness, that's my friend. Well, what these psalmists do is they show that when you get out of disequilibrium, there's a way to get back into that, right? So another really important starting point for a whole lot of reasons, but the one under consideration tonight is to spend time in the Psalms, because they're very helpful to see, I'm not by myself in this, but also to see how these psalmists overcame it. Now, for a host of reasons, we had a lot of people in the Bible who wanted to die. You ever thought about how many there are? We think about Moses. God is getting ready to strike the people, and Moses says, look, just take me instead. Just get me out of the picture. And there's times as well when Moses is discouraged, and it's like, why have you done all this to me? We think about Job. You talk about a man who could be depressed. Right? Here is his entire world turned upside down. The red X is all over the place in his life. And he makes the same plea to God. Just take me. Just kill me right now. We think about Elijah. He had this tremendous victory. God had used him in such a grand way. And because the wicked Queen Jezebel decided she wanted to kill him, Elijah thought his life was over. He had just forgotten what God had shown him. And so he goes off by himself and he says, just take my life. Right here and now, I want to die. And God has to talk to him about that. Prophet Jeremiah, same way. Here's a man who is prophesying in terrible times. Some of the most wicked we could think about. And it's as if he's feeling all by himself in all of this. And he prays for the Lord to take his life. Think about Jonah. Very different kind of prophet. Very selfish. Not like Jeremiah, who was just totally upset because of the wickedness around him. Jonah was upset because God was merciful. And he says, I would rather die than to witness you do good. Now, for all of these men, there was a problem. There was a disequilibrium in their life. And so the way they wanted to deal with it is just simply to be taken out of the picture, because that seemed like the easiest way that it could happen. And of course, with depression, there's a very strong link between that and suicide for this reason, that you've got something that you just don't feel like you can overcome. And so let me just get out of this life. Let me just get out of the problem in that way. So, it's nothing new. It's nothing God's hidden from us. It's nothing God has said. Nobody's ever gone through this before. No, He's shown us a number of people who do. Now, with that in mind, I want us to understand that maybe a better term for describing some situations is the term melancholia or melancholy. You don't hear that term much anymore. It's an old term, but it gives us kind of a different nuance, really. It would be, if you could put it one way, it's like when you get the blues, right? You wouldn't consider yourself to be depressed necessarily, but it's just this feeling in your life for a season that not all is going well. And I think that was the description of a lot of these people. And so we can feel that way too. There's nothing wrong in that. The problem is when we allow it to then build into what we might call depression. Okay, so what are some things we need to be concerned about with depression? One is that we oftentimes are going to be deceived by it. Depression very much is a temptation, and we need to treat it that way. That what it's doing is it's tempting us to go away from believing that God can take care of us. So wherever there's a sin, we know from Genesis chapter 3, there's going to be some kind of deception there. Let me show you just a few of these that I've come across. One is, because I am unhappy, that means I'm depressed. That's not an equation. Okay? Unhappiness does not necessarily mean depression. Happiness very much depends on our circumstance, doesn't it? I used to describe it like this when I was teaching, tying this again with economics. Think about, maybe this is a very apropos illustration after last week. Think of the stock market. Think of the stock market. A president can say something, one sentence, and the stock market drops 1,000 points. Now, why did that happen? It's very reactionary, right? Or you hear that unemployment numbers are way down. Stock market shoots up 1,000 points. It's very much related to that moment in time, and that's the way happiness is. So we think about days that we are very happy. Maybe it's our birthday or anniversary. Something good comes along. But there's some times where we begin to believe that if I have any kind of negative downturn in my life that is not making me happy, that I can identify that as depression. It's a very dangerous thing to do. Self-diagnosis typically is. And in the age of the internet, where we go online to figure out what's wrong with us, if we're not really careful, we can turn something that is not depression into something that is. So we have to be careful of that decision. Now, let me give you a variation of that. Why can't I be happy like everybody else? So you look around, and here's all these smiling faces. Things are going well for everybody else. They've got nice families, and they're happy, and they've got a nice house and a nice car. Again, the internet has not been our friend on that one. You think about the social media websites, Facebook, Instagram, whatever flavor it is you want to look at. And someone has their page. What do they post on it? Well, you do have some people that post every negative thing that happens to them. There is that group. But the vast majority of people are having pictures, things are going well, they're on vacation, they're happy, they've been to a party, somebody's had a big event, and a lot of times they'll put something at the bottom like hashtag so blessed. Someone who's bordering on depression will go to that, and it feeds. Right? It says, well, look, everybody's getting something but me. And spiritual people, if you're not really careful, will oftentimes start saying, why isn't God blessing me like he blesses them? Why is God playing favorites with this group? So happiness has to be understood, that it's very different than biblical joy, and it is certainly very different than depression. Now, let's look at it from a little bit different angle. This is one that I heard from a man who has struggled with depression all of his adult life and negligent of his family because of it. And I've talked to him a number of times. Sadly, at this particular moment, things have not taken a good turn for him. But nonetheless, when we've talked in the past, one of the statements he made is that nobody knows what I'm going through. And I guess to a certain extent, that's got some truth in it. I could say, nobody understands my life as a gospel preacher. Well, if I'm being very specific, and at this moment in time, preaching for the Gooch Lane Church with that set of people, I guess I am unique in that. But I have a feeling Brother Hall knows something about preaching. And that if he and I got together, we would share some similarities. Or when I talk to other men, they would say, oh yeah, I know exactly what's going on. And it may be, I thought, this is the first time this has ever happened to anybody. Right? And I start talking to other people and maybe find out it's a pretty common thing. But what depression does is it says, you don't need to listen to anybody else. And so if I can convince myself that nobody understands what's going on but me, that gives me the excuse not to listen. So this particular man, I don't know how many times I said, the only way you're going to get over this is get a job, fill up your time, don't sit around thinking about how terrible things are, spend time with your children, spend time with your wife. But he had placed himself in a situation where he felt he could dismiss what I'm saying because I didn't understand. So see the danger in that. We also consider a deception that says, I am a victim of depression. I was born this way. This is just the way I am. Now, I will say there are some people who do have a little bit more melancholy personality than others. There are some people who seem to be born with maybe a little bit more of a negative slant on life. But to say that I am a victim immediately places me in a very passive role, right? There's nothing I can do about it. We hear something like, I just can't handle it. I just can't deal with it. We live in a culture that has really elevated victimhood. Now, I am very sympathetic to people who go through trauma. But the only way you heal from trauma is to say, I will not be a victim to it. I will not allow whatever that might be to define who I am, define what my life is going to be like. And if I'm constantly sitting around thinking of something that happened to me where I was mistreated, maybe physically, maybe verbally, maybe emotionally, or all of them, and I say, I just can't get over this, then I've put myself in a very passive situation. Now, one other I want to mention along these lines is the cure is in finding the right medication. The 1990s were really the age of the pill. That you could find a pill that would cure most anything. And so I remember seeing on the cover of, I think it was Newsweek magazine, Are We Close? And it was showing all these pills that you could take them and it's going to put you where you need to be. And so throughout the 1990s, 2000s as well, there has been this just constant giving of medication, prescriptions being given, and like the young man I mentioned to you earlier, multiple prescriptions being given. So here's the thing. I'm not dismissing that. I'm not going to say that they are never helpful, but I want to illustrate it with a different kind of medication. Maybe that some of you are diabetic. If you're diabetic, you know what this picture is for you, right? This is life. That if you do not have that insulin, there's going to be no survival. Let me ask you this. What if this is your diet? You're diabetic and you're eating chocolate cake and you're filling up on candy and you're eating these high-carb foods like pizza, and that's just a regular part of your life. You're not going to survive. Why is that? Because someone who has diabetes understands that while I may and do need that medicine, I also have to change my lifestyle. So you get the diagnosis from your doctor. Doctor says, you got to cut out all of these things. You got to start eating this kind of thing. What you've got to do is completely change your eating habits. I want to suggest to you that's the same way with depression. That those medicines may be where they can open a window in my life. And it gives me enough time of clear thinking to say, okay, I'm viewing my life. I'm seeing all these things I've got to cut out. Sitting around by myself, looking at things I don't need to be looking at, being around people who are not encouraging me in a godly way. I got to get rid of all this so that I can get myself to that equilibrium where I want to be. So, while medication may do some good, it is not a cure. And if we ever think that we're going to be cured from depression if our doctor can just get the right prescription for us, we're going to be sadly disappointed with that. All right, so those are the deceptions. Now, let's get to the main part here. How is it that we overcome depression? How is it, if I'm struggling with it, or if I have a family member who's struggling with it, the advice that I would give, let me reiterate, it starts with God. It starts with God. If I am a person of faith, then I must trust that God does care for me and God fully has it within His power to help me get over this X in my life, to have that equilibrium of loving life and seeing good days. Now, what I'm about to say may sound very generic, but I don't want it to. The way we overcome depression is when we personify that depression. So, it is something that we are going to view as our enemy. Let me illustrate that. When you visualize your enemy, it shows you who you're fighting against. It's showing you what it is that's bringing you down. Now, when we do this, we're going to find that we can look it in the face and say, I'm going to be the winner here. Now, we do this with medical issues all the time. So look at this illustration. You may recognize this picture where it says fighting for Kate. This is a young lady. She's now 15, 16 years old. When she was very young, she was diagnosed with leukemia. And we went through that with the family there at Gooch Lane and the struggles that they had. And now she's doing very well, thriving. But a few years ago, her mother wrote this book. It's a good read, by the way. But I want you to notice the title, Fighting. Fighting for Kate. Who are they fighting? They were fighting cancer. Right? It was as if this problem within her body was visualized as the enemy. For a while, we had a couple whose granddaughter was diagnosed with Rett syndrome. I'd never heard of that before then, but very, very debilitating problem. And the grandparents did fundraisers. Look at the logo for the Rett syndrome organization. Fight Rett syndrome. And then, don't you love this? Love, support, fight. And then another big problem that a lot of kids are having these days is autism. Look at their logo, fighting for autism. But we understand what they're meaning is they're fighting for people who have it. They're visualizing this as an enemy. So when we're dealing with depression, that's exactly what we need to do. We need to see it as our enemy. Now, we get back to the Bible and we see that God also shows us how to do that. I've picked this passage from Galatians 5, where the Apostle Paul says, beginning in verse 16, "But I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh, for the desires of the flesh are against the Spirit, and the desires of the Spirit are against the flesh, for those are opposed to each other to keep you from doing the things you want to do." Paul turned the flesh into the enemy. He said, when you think about all these things, you might think about there in Galatians 5 with the problems of the flesh, all these different things that he describes. He says, they are your enemy. And what you've got to do is to picture all of these desires and temptations as the enemy who's trying to stop you from being spiritually minded, trying to stop you from allowing the Spirit to have His work within you. So, the apostle is telling us how we do that. And as we consider that, we understand that this is one enemy we don't have to love. While there may be people, and we love them and we're trying to change them, when it's something like a physical illness, or it's our fleshly desires trying to bring us down, or it's this depression that's trying to bring us down, God says you do not have to love that enemy. And what you need to do is to fight. Okay? That gets us out of that passive frame of mind that we are going to be aggressive in not allowing this depression to take us somewhere where we don't want to be. Let's look at 2 Corinthians 10. Beginning in verse 3, the apostle says, "For though we walk in the flesh, we are not waging war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of good, and take every thought captive to obey Christ." This is good advice for any problem. That if there is something that is debilitating us, whatever that might be, it's kind of like we block it in. And the way we do that is to think about the fight that we're involved in and who the winner is going to be. The winner is going to be Jesus Christ, and I'm replacing these thoughts with things about Jesus and how Jesus can help me through these things, and I take those thoughts captive, just as the apostle describes here in 2 Corinthians chapter 10. So once again, and I've said this 2 or 3 times, I guess just because it's such an important point, we don't give ourselves an excuse to be depressed. We don't say, I just can't win. Or there's nothing I can do. If there's nothing I can do, there's no hope. Because what God has said is, when you turn yourself to me, I'm going to help you win that. So we get rid of those notions. We get rid of those things that give way to passiveness. So we personify. We see who the enemy is, and we go after it. Now, the most important thing, I believe, when we talk about Christians who are dealing with depression, is to make sure that we have a real, and I've put that word in there on purpose, that we have a real relationship with God. So, let's talk about that. A real relationship with God would be opposed to one that's casual. Casual relationship with God says, I'm going to fill a bench. When the doors are open to the church building, I'll be there, I'll fill a bench, and I'll sing along, and I'll bow my head when I pray. I'll take the Lord's Supper. But that's about it. That's about the extent of where my relationship with God goes. And so what we become is not a very good Christian, but maybe a really good church member. right? We're there. We're building the numbers up. People are counting on us. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not dismissing regular church attendance. Very important. What I am saying is casual relationship says that's the top. That's it. That's where it's filled up. And so, if that is my relationship with God, at the very best, it's going to be kind of neutral. It's not going to be really good or bad. So what I must do then is understand, at its worst, it's going to increase my depression. Because I'm going to come to the church building and I'm going to hear all these happy voices singing and I'm going to see all the smiles and it's going to kick me into what we talked about earlier. I just can't be happy. Everybody else is happy but me. I can't deal with this. And I'm not turning to God to help me with that. That's the danger. That's the problem. So how do we deal with that then? Well, again, God's told us. I want you to look with me over to Psalm 34. Psalm 34, and we're going to read this psalm, and then we'll just briefly talk a little bit about it. I think in a lot of ways, this is an equilibrium psalm. Let's begin here, verse 1. I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be in my mouth. My soul makes its boast in the Lord. Let the humble hear and be glad. Oh, magnify the Lord with me, and let us exalt his name together. I sought the Lord, and he answered me and delivered me from all my fears. Those who look at him are radiant, and their faces shall never be ashamed. The poor man cried, and the Lord heard him and saved him out of all of his troubles. The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him and delivers them. Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man who takes refuge in him. Oh, fear the Lord, you his saints, for those who fear him have no lack. The young lions suffer want and hunger, but those who seek the Lord lack no good thing. Come, O children, listen to me, and I will teach you to fear the Lord. What man is there who desires life and loves many days that he may see good? So that's where Peter was when he wrote this. Keep your tongue from evil and your lips from speaking deceit. Burn away from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it. The eyes of the Lord are toward the righteous, and his ears toward their cry. The face of the Lord is against those who do evil, to cut off the memory of them from the earth. When the righteous cry for help, the Lord hears and delivers them out of all their troubles. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of them all. He keeps all his bones. Not one of them is broken. Affliction will slay the wicked, and those who hate the righteous will be condemned. The Lord redeems the life of his servants. None of those who take refuge in him will be condemned. There's a lot of parts of this chapter that are what I call poster verses. You pull them out, put them on a poster, put them on a t-shirt, have them on stationery. But when you read the entirety of this psalm, a picture begins to emerge. So here, as David is writing, it appears there's been a problem in his life, right? But listen to what David says. As we go through the psalm, he says, I will bless God. I will praise God. I will magnify God. I will seek God. I will cry out to God. I will taste and see that God is good. I'll take refuge in God, and I'll fear God. Now, those are very proactive statements where David is saying, if I'm going to have a real relationship with God, I've got to understand who he is. You see, God is not just studying doctrine. Right? Now, doctrine's important. Doctrine is what gets us to be where God wants us to be. But we've got to see God as our creator, as this one who keeps the universe running as we know it, the God who is above all. And so as David considers that, he says, when I think about God, I'm going to magnify him. I'm going to seek him. I'm going to find him. When I have problems, I'm going to cry out to him. When these problems occur, I'm going to take refuge in him. That's what we've got to do. And so if I am beleaguered with the problem of depression, I need to read Psalms like this. And I need to say, okay, this is assertive. This is aggressive. This is saying, I've got to build my relationship with God. Now, David continues on, and he says, here's what the Lord's going to do. The Lord's going to protect. The Lord's going to give generously. The Lord's going to hear. The Lord is going to deliver. Now, there may be long seasons of our life where it does not appear God's doing that. There may be seasons where I'm praying fervently for these things, but it doesn't look like God's giving generously. It's at moments like this I've just got to hang on. I've got to trust that for whatever reason, in God's good working of His plan, there is a reason He's delaying this. And that may be for my own spiritual growth. That may be for the spiritual growth of someone else. How many of us have been so blessed by watching someone valiantly face a sickness, where we have seen someone who stood up and they said, this is not going to destroy my faith, and we're built up by that. David says, I know the Lord's going to come through. And he says, in relation to all of this, I must approach Him in humility. I got to consider that He's right. I've got to stay away from evil. I've got to do good. I've got to seek, and I've got to pursue it. None of those things are generic. None of these things are just fodder for a sermon where we really just say these things, but we don't know what they mean. All of these are very doable, and they need to be done by every Christian. But concerning our topic tonight, especially those who are struggling to develop that real relationship with God. So, how do I get over depression? I personify the enemy. I develop this real relationship with God. I also connect with people around me. If you went to the most secular psychiatrist you could find, and you said, how do I get over depression? I can guarantee you, one of the things he or she is going to say is, you got to be around people. You got to get out there and be around people. And that's exactly what God says. Because we look, again, at places in the Bible where this point is made. I'm very intrigued by this verse. 2 Corinthians 7:6. Paul writes, but God who comforts the downcast comforted us. What does that say about Paul? Paul was downcast. Sounds like Paul had a little melancholia going on. And so here's a situation that had brought them down, those with him, and he says, but the coming of Titus, that lifted us up. You ever had a situation like that? You've just been feeling blue. Somebody comes on into the scene, and it's just like the light flips. We think also about 1 Thessalonians. We urge you, brothers, admonish the idle. And then note this phrase, encourage the faint-hearted. So that word encourage, look at how it's made up. In with the word courage. So the meaning of that is, it's kind of like you get an infusion. You know, you need more blood, you need whatever. You go to the hospital, they infuse you with that. Paul says, you need to infuse courage into the faint-hearted. Why do I need to be around other Christians? Because I need them infusing me with that courage. That's how we overcome. That's why connecting with community is such an important thing. Think about a host of one another passages. Love one another. Pray for one another. Admonish one another. All of these things are showing that God has always intended for Christianity to be community. Never going off as an individual. We are part of a large family, and we behave in that way. So if I'm struggling with these things, one thing I had better not do is withdraw. And I've noticed that with Christians who struggle with depression, one of the first things they'll do is they'll start getting really sporadic in their church attendance. It needs to be just the opposite. If I'm saying to myself, I really don't want to go, that is the warning sign, I better get there and be there. And it may be it's a painful thing, it may be that it's difficult, but it is absolutely necessary. That's what God's telling us here. That one of the ways that we deal with these problems is we come and we associate with each other and we build each other up in that courage. Now, we need to be patient. If I'm struggling with depression, there are going to be those who say the right thing in the wrong way. There are times that there are people who want to help, and they're going to come to me, and it may be they say something just in a very bad way. I need to cut them some slack. Because what they're seeking to do is to build me up. Even though the words may get twisted or it could have been said in a lot better way, I need to cut them some slack in that because they have my best interest in mind. Now let me turn that around a bit. If you know of a Christian who is struggling with depression, don't be silent. Don't say, well, there's nothing I can do. There may not be, right? It may not be that there's anything you can really do to get this person over it, but there may be. And it may be that this Christian brother or sister who's struggling with depression needs someone just to sit and talk. You don't have to have all this golden wisdom. In fact, I would discourage that because when we try to be wise, we typically end up being pretty foolish. If there's things, though, that you can say that are good, say them, but it may just be that somebody needs a friend. That's how I infuse courage. That's how I help my brothers and sisters to stay faithful, to overcome these times in that way. So, we connect with community. Let me just end, maybe on a rather strange note. We just need to get out and sweat. Bible has good things to say about working. We look over in Ecclesiastes chapter 5 and verse 12, where it says, "Sweet is the sleep of a laborer, whether he eats little or much, but the full stomach of the rich will not let him sleep." We almost always jump to the latter part of that verse. And we say, here's the danger when you're worried about your money. Look at the first part. People who get out and work, just earning a day's living, get out, physical labor, their sleep is good. Again, go to the most secular psychiatrist, you're going to hear something like that. But what I want us to see is that while work is good, getting out, mowing the yard, trimming the bushes, whatever, you're not sitting in the house, that's the main thing. For the people of God, we can take that in a much better direction. That we can also put our mind to the task. So here I am, I'm working, my back is in it, but my mind is in it also. So what do? I work by serving others. So not only am I getting out of my house, not only am I getting my mind on something else, I'm encouraging somebody else in the process. So we've made the point tonight that depression focuses in on us. That it's our world, that nobody understands, that we're victims. What I'm suggesting to you with this point gets us out of that. It says, I'm going to look towards someone else that I can help. And so it takes the focus off of me and it places it where it needs to be. Now, let's think about how we do this. Philippians chapter 2, verse 4. Let each of you look not only to his own interest, but also to the interest of others. We think about what he says here. We think about Mark chapter 10. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So then, it may be something small in the beginning. Sending a card, sending an email, sending a text to someone, making a phone call to someone who's sick. It may build beyond that, where I'm actually doing physical labor to help somebody, maybe who's laid up from an illness, but it's accomplishing so many things in the fact that I'm thinking about somebody besides me. And what it's doing is it's putting me lockstep with Jesus Christ, who could have demanded service from us and would have been perfectly justified to do that as our king. But he said, no, I'm the servant king. I'm coming to serve. And I hope we can look at that as well. So we've covered a lot of ground tonight. We've talked about the deceptions. We've talked about how we can overcome those deceptions, personifying that enemy, getting a real relationship with God, getting busy, getting active. But I'll just sum all of this up by saying to overcome it means that I'm first looking upward. I'm trusting that God can fix this if I'm willing to allow that. And so I read those Psalms like we read earlier, and I say the first thing I'm going to do is to build my relationship with God. I'm going to trust Him. I'm going to believe that He can save me in times of trouble. And then I start turning to my brethren, maybe asking for help sometimes, but even more importantly, I'm seeking to give that help. So upward and outward. Let me just close with this. Depression is not something that's going to be a one and done fix. That's not how it works. What it means, though, is that we are working day after day to change our lives, to change our attitudes, to change our outlook to what God wants it to be. And with His help, I can make that change. And there may be seasons where I feel that temptation coming on, just like a drunkard may feel, though he's been sober for 30 years, the taste of that alcohol coming out after him. He has to say no. And when I feel those depressed ideas coming along, I say no, and I turn to God even more, and I turn to helping others. So, I hope this has been helpful to you tonight. I hope that we see that this is something that God has dealt with, and He said that it's something that we can overcome. Appreciate your good attention this evening. We typically end a sermon with offering an invitation, regardless if that's been our topic or not. And really, in some ways, it has and hasn't. What can help us overcome depression? It's knowing that our eternity is secure. And come what may. When I go down in those waters of baptism, that God makes me into a new person, and that I am raised free from sin, and that He said, now my son can live in you. And we can trust that no matter what that red X may be in our life, that through Jesus Christ we can overcome it, that we can be the people that we need to be. And so what an encouraging thing that God has given us that great blessing. And so maybe that's where you are tonight. I don't know if that's the case, if there's any in our number this evening who are not Christians, but if you have not made that decision, now would be a really good time to do it. If you're struggling with depression, I'd encourage you to let that be known to this group tonight. Not that you're repenting. That's not what I'm saying. It's just to say, I recognize that I need the help of others. And I want you to know where I am. And if you're not quite comfortable doing that, I would encourage you to talk to the members of this congregation that you really, really rely on and trust. Or maybe there is a sin and that's why you're depressed. You're depressed for good reason, because you know that your relationship with God isn't right. Tonight's an opportunity to get that right. We're not in the business of forgiving and that kind of thing. I can forgive a sin against me, but this church is not the one that's forgiving. No. When you confess a sin before a church, we go together with you to the throne room of God. And we accompany you as you pour your heart out to Him and say, I want this forgiveness, because every Christian of age in this room understands what that's like. We're not judges. We're peers. We know what it's like. And so I would encourage you this evening, if any of those things are applicable to you, that you would take that opportunity as we stand and as we sing together. When we walk with the Lord in the light of